Thank you for joining today's webinar on how to achieve true-to-life 3D color rendering with the PBR neutral tone mapper presented by Emmett Lalish from Google. First, a couple of housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the presentation, please ask them using the Q&A feature located on your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. We are recording this webinar and we'll share the link to the recording along with the slides on the events webpage. At the end of the session, please complete the short survey to help us better design future events. With that, I'll hand it off to Emmett Lalish, Staff Software Engineer at Google. Emmett?
Thank you. Let me share my screen here. All right. Thank you for the introduction. So I do a lot of 3D rendering at Google. I run the open source model viewer component, web component, if you've ever run across that. But I also work with a lot of internal teams at Google to get 3D rendering working better. So one of those is the GStore team. They now use model viewer and GLTF rendering on pretty much all of their products on their website for things like this, the Pixel Watch. And obviously they care deeply about making sure that their products look as best they possibly can, because we don't have very many of them. So we can spend a lot of time making them good. And I've been helping with that, and we've still got a long way to go. But one thing that I found while we were working is that they were having a lot of difficulty hitting the colors that they needed. And I realized in talking to them just how important color accuracy is in e-commerce, because of course, marketing has very specific ideas of exactly what color should be shown for a given product. And it matters for the bottom line, because if a customer sees something and chooses a product based on the color they see on their screen, and they receive it in the mail and it doesn't look the same color, they're pretty likely to return it. And that costs companies a lot of money. So color accuracy is a really important thing. But what we hadn't been thinking about enough, I realized, was tone mapping. I've been rendering for quite a while, and for much of that time, I hadn't given much thought to tone mapping. Model Viewer, like many other renderers on the web, was using AEC tone mapping, which is a film industry standard. And that was about as much thought as ever went into it. Hey, there's a film industry standard for this. Looks okay. Great. Use it. And this is the render that you get. It's not terrible, except when you go back to looking at the input texture for this watch's display. And you see that the input texture was actually distinctly yellow, has varying shades of yellow. But when it's rendered under ASIS, it's been washed out to the point where these yellows are almost completely gray. And the marketing folks are taking a look at this and said, that's unacceptable. Like we need it to be this color. What's going on? And there was a lot of messing around, trying to change the colors of the base texture to then get the colors that you wanted on the screen. That took a lot of manual effort. But sometimes we found that actually there wasn't anything we could do. There was no color we could choose in the base color texture to get where we wanted. And that became a big problem. So then I started looking into this more seriously. And so, this is kind of motivation, because what ended up coming out of this after quite a bit of time was a new tone mapper specifically for the needs of e-commerce, which I don't think anybody has ever tried to do before. There are a lot of tone mappers, but generally they're all built for film and games, which are really different use cases. So you can see up here how we managed to retain color much better than in ACES. And interestingly, we even retain color better than with no tone mapping, what people will often call a linear or a clamped tone mapper. And a lot of times people assume when they have trouble with tone mapping that by disabling it, they will get the colors that they want. And that's in fact not true either. And it gets to the heart of why tone mapping is so important and is nothing but trade-offs. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So this is kind of motivation. So the goals here for PBR neutral are a PBR. We're going for PBR shading, right? Physically based rendering is the goal application for this. It's not going to be designed for every scenario. But we are interested in HDR lighting, which is to say high dynamic range, realistic lighting. It could be studio lighting, it could be outdoor lighting, it could be indoor. But we're serious about having good lighting because that's really important for showing products well. But what we want to develop is a safe color zone. And much as I would like to say that we can just pass every single color through correctly or without adjustment, that's in fact not possible for reasons I'll go into. But we do want a large safe zone within our sRGB colors where we can be sure that these are going to come out the way we expect. Now, we obviously can't make any guarantee like that under generic lighting, because the whole purpose of PBR, to be physically correct, is that if you put an object under colored lighting, its color is going to change according to that colored lighting. That's what makes things look real. That's great. That's a feature. But at least when we're talking about grayscale lighting, we can say something specific about what colors you're going to get on the screen. And that's important because when we think about studio lighting, when we think about the kinds of lighting that we want for e-commerce products, grayscale lighting is generally the goal. And it's exactly because we're looking for color accuracy. But this is still going to work just fine under colored lighting. It's just that, you won't get these same exactness guarantees because that would defeat the purpose of PBR. We're looking for smooth gradients, right? We need to make sure that we're not introducing visual artifacts, and your eyes will really quickly pick up on colors and shades that are changing too fast. But it's important to have what's called a path to white. When we have a very bright light, even if it's reflecting off of a blue object, like the sphere in the upper left, you still expect to see that light as turning white, even though it physically really is blue. And this is just a trick of our visual perception cortex that, like a camera, when our eyes are overexposed in a small region, we tend to kind of lose perception of that color a bit. So this is all part of basically being perceptually good, which is unfortunately impossible to define quantitatively, but we can look at a lot of objects, which is exactly what we've done to improve things. So, and of course we have live demos of this, so keep an eye out for links where you can play around with these things. So quick background on ACES, because this, for no real intentional reason, kind of had become a industry standard kind of accidental default in the web commerce rendering space. It is originally a film standard, but it has surprisingly poor color accuracy. You can really notice in some of these spheres, you look in the upper left, there's a blue sphere where those highlights are actually turning purple. We're also getting, reds turning orange. You can see some of these like orange and yellow spheres are getting washed out and actually changing hue a bit. The oranges are turning more yellow. Now, I'll be honest, as an engineer, some of this stuff is a little subtle for my taste. It was difficult to notice at first, but when I talk to artists, when I talk to marketers, they could absolutely, they're much more trained in looking at the subtle distinctions between colors, and these things jump out at them immediately as being unreasonable representations of their products. You'll also notice with ACES that those white spheres at the bottom, the difference in grayscales is almost completely lost. So the white sphere looks a lot like the medium gray sphere when they're rendered, and that's a bit of a problem. So I'm going to go in and show you a little bit more about how I'm analyzing this situation. But first, I want to talk about reachable colors. So one interesting thing I noticed when I started doing data analysis of the ACES tone mapper is that if you want canary yellow in a GLTF to come out as canary yellow on the screen, it's actually physically impossible. You can't do it because in GLTF, as in most 3D rendering pipelines, our textures and our lights are represented in the sRGB gamut, what they call the Rec 709 gamut. And this is a relatively small gamut. It's kind of the oldest and most broadly used. And what's interesting about that is with the PBR workflow, the actual shaders computing everything in floating point, if all of your inputs from your base colors and your lights are in Rec 709, it means no matter what PBR has done, all of your outputs are already in Rec 709. They can't possibly escape it. But that also means that sRGB, it's not sRGB anymore because PBR can get very, very bright, but it's in the same gamut as sRGB, this Rec 709. And so what I did was said, well, okay, say we take all the possible colors of Rec 709 and we tone map them with different tone mappers. What is that bounding envelope? what's the reachable set of sRGB that we can get to? Because that's the whole point of a tone mapper, is to map you back into your 0 to 1 output range. And what I found is that this shape here, cyan, bright green, canary yellow, they're completely unreachable. Now, this isn't true in the film industry because they use wide gamut inputs. They aren't limited to Rec. 709 like we are. So they may have not noticed this. And also they may not care because they may not need those bright colors as much for a pleasing film in a theater. But for our products, it's very important. And so what I set out to do is build this PBR neutral tone mapper, which was designed specifically to handle the gamut better and basically, be designed for our e-commerce use cases and make it so that much more of these colors are reachable. Interestingly, you can't quite make them all reachable, as you can see in the diagram. There are trade-offs here. So to give you an idea of sort of the analytical approach I took here, this is what I'm calling a 3D Macbeth chart. If you're familiar with photography, there's a thing called a Macbeth chart that has this particular grid of colors that are very well calibrated, and everybody uses these in photo shoots to adjust their exposure, to adjust their lighting, to adjust their post-processing, to make sure that colors are the real color that they should be, because that's actually a difficult problem in photography as well. And so what I found, so I built a 3D model of this, and I basically turned each of those color swatches into spheres, but I turned them into 3 spheres. So the middle one is an unlit sphere, which means it has no tone mapping applied, it has no PBR shading applied. It is literally just that sRGB value projected to the screen. And then I made a shiny sphere and a matte sphere, or a rough sphere, that have those same base color sRGB values. And those are PBR rendered and tone mapped. And what's interesting about this is you can do some math in PBR and say, oh, well, if we put this in under a lighting environment that is pure white, it's 111 in every direction. It's a pure white scene. This is totally impossible to get in the real world. But for analytical lighting, we can do this. And if you do that, you can show that you should get the base color directly back out, no matter what point you look at on the sphere. It's basically, it sort of, in a sense, it removes the shading, even though the shader is running. This is really useful for doing analytical comparisons. So we can actually have quantitative metrics on how well we're doing. There are a couple of caveats, though. So when you look at the rough and the shiny spheres, you will actually notice that they are subtly different, right? If you can see in this render, there's 2 effects at work there. One is the Fresnel effect, and this is an effect on the shiny sphere. So that's the rear sphere here. And the Fresnel effect is mixing in white, so basically desaturating the color as it gets close to the edge of the sphere. So it's really the center of the sphere, that F90 point, that's the spot that we expect to be exactly the same as the unlit base color. And around as it gets towards the edges, it fades out a little bit. The other thing you'll notice is that the matte sphere that's in front is just a little bit darker. This is from multi-scattering. This is, again, an intentional thing that's done in PBR renders because rough objects have, basically tiny little caves in between the bumps that make them rough. And those tiny little caves are bouncing light around more and absorbing it a little bit more. And that's exactly why, especially the dark colors tend to get a little bit darker. So again, that's intentional. You don't expect those to be exactly identical to the original unlit object. So just keep that in mind. But they're pretty close. So the next question we say is, okay, so what if we just don't use tone mapping? That's actually been a pretty common approach when people are faced with trying to get color accuracy. They say, okay, let's go for a linear, kind of what I would call a clamped tone mapper, because anything above 1 is just clamped back to 1. That happens independently in RGB. And what you find is that actually the base color is not the output. You'll notice that this is actually more different than the one before. What you might notice is that specifically, especially on some of these darker colors, if you take a look, those spheres are significantly desaturated. They're grayer than the corresponding unlit circles, to the point that in the black sphere, you've actually got a pretty significant black has turned into a definite gray. But like the purple, the brown, it's a significant difference that is that makes basically your products look washed out. And the reason this happens is, again, because of the Fresnel effect. When you look at even just straight on for a shiny object, you're actually adding 4% white with a PBR shader. And that's correct. That's physically right. It's just that the base color factor in a texture is not really the output color, right? They're not actually measuring the same thing, because anytime you've looked at an object or taken a photo of an object, it's had this 4% white built into it already. So you don't realize that the color you need in your base color is actually a little bit different. And that's really annoying when you're trying to match product colors. When you look at ACES, it's even worse than linear. You'll notice it has significant hue shifts. It's got a lot more saturation loss. Take a look at like these yellows, for instance. And white is turning gray, so you can't even hardly tell the difference between the three brightest white spheres. And you can see in the unlit examples, there's a lot of difference in the base color, but it's just imperceptible in the output. So that might be fine for film, but it's a huge problem for commerce. So now we take a look at PBR neutral. And this is sort of where we got to when it's finally been fixed up. And what we ended up doing was finding an exact range and for the colors, and we actually built in a fix for the saturation. So the fact that PBR basically desaturates all colors by about 4% on average, we can actually apply a correction for that. And that's really, it's an average correction. It's not like it's removing the Fresnel effect or something. But by making this average correction, we are now able to basically give the promise that, yes, the sRGB value put in as base color really will be the sRGB value that you get out in sort of a nice average sense. And so you don't have to think about doing these weird corrections anymore. And this just makes it much more convenient for our use cases. And this, because of this, we're able to get a contrast toe. You can see a couple of places here where we don't have an exact range everywhere. For the purely saturated colors, for the really bright whites, we're not actually able to match them identically to the base color, because we have to have trade-offs to remove the visual artifacts around highlights and bright points. And so this is sort of this fundamental trade-off, but we've kind of minimized that range. And so you can see how we did that by looking at the curves that were actually developed for this tone mapper. And so basically the green part of this curve, the top is in linear space. So you're looking at sort of linear light in and linear light out. And the bottom is the exact same curves, but just with the x-axis in a log plot. So you can see up to the orders of magnitude higher brightness that you get in highlights from lights. And so what you see is this green part is basically our exact range. This is where we can say, if you're between 0.08 and 0.8, this is in linear space. You have to convert that for sRGB. Then we can basically make these guarantees about these values coming out exactly under white light. And then the red portion up here is where we're compressing the highlights. The blue portion at the bottom is the contrast toe, which sort of gives us a smooth transition to blacks. And you'll notice like a lot of tone mappers like AEC have a contrast toe as well. And this one kind of comes out naturally from the way that we did the saturation correction. And then this purple curve is showing our path to white. It's the way that we desaturate colors as they get increasingly bright. And this is sort of the way that we give people a perceptual cue that brightness has been removed. We aren't able to show a super bright thing. So instead, we show this desaturation that gives their brain the ability to understand what's happening, despite our lower output values of our screens than real life. And finally, this is done with a really cheap and fast shader. So this is easy to implement. And now I'm going back to this, but now, we're going to look at the same scene, but instead of under analytical lighting, we'll look at it under, say, outdoor lighting. So this is a sunrise with a really bright and yellow sun And people often say like, well, why not just use no tone mapping, right? Why not just use linear? It's probably close enough. What you'll see is that actually, because no tone mapping clamps the R, G, and B values independently, it actually leads to crazy hue shifts. You can really see this on some of the oranges and greens, where they sort of transition first to like a bright orange and then to a bright yellow, before going to white. And it's pretty nonsensical. And that's because, right, like there's a reason we need a tone mapping function. Simple clamped tone mapping introduces all kinds of unwanted artifacts. You'll also notice, for instance, in the upper left, how the area of bright sun is just like a pure saturated blue because it's reflecting off of a blue sphere. That's not particularly useful. Um, so it's and we also lose some contrast here for the reasons given before, where we're actually, PBR is already desaturating our colors, and this isn't correcting for it. If you look at ACES, ACES looks a lot nicer. There's a reason people defaulted to ACES. It does do a good job, and especially it does a nice job of smooth gradients. You can see how that's really improved the look of a lot of these spheres. But it has some interesting problems too. Again, you can see the blues turning purple. It has some other strange hue shifts as the oranges turn more yellow. But it is nice and high contrast, and that it just sort of looks good. If you compare an ACES render to a linear render, you will immediately see this distinction of contrast, where the linear just feels washed out. So that was an important thing we realized needed to be included. And when we jump over to PBR neutral, we now have this sort of in between where we are now preserving the hues in a guaranteed way. We do have a path to white, like like ACES does. We're now maintaining contrast. We're maintaining saturation. We're really keeping true to the colors. But the trade-off with that is we have a faster roll-off for our highlights, and that means it's less smooth. You can see on these spheres, the gradients don't look quite as nice as they did with ACES. And the reason I use this object is because this object is exactly designed to pull out the problems. This is not a particularly real-world commerce object. Most real objects are much more complicated than this, and so it's harder to notice these very subtle gradient distinctions. But it's easy to notice on these spheres, and that's why we focused here, to really make sure we knew what we were doing. So we do know that it looks worse a little bit than ACES on this particular model, but it's worth it for the improved colors and for the fact that it looks a lot better on realistic models. But I also want to point out that PBR neutral is not at all the be-all and end-all of tone mappers. It is not a filmic tone mapper. It should not be used for film. Most folks who evaluate tone mappers do it by grabbing something like this, an HDR image that's maybe a grab from a movie, and that they know is a difficult situation for a tone mapper, and they'll apply the different tone mappers and say, hey, how does it look? And what you will find if you compare PBR neutral that way is it does worse, because it's not for that, right? I mean, I would say maybe in this case it does a little better than ACES. It's not turning the coffee sign purple, at least. But AGX, a more modern filmic tone mapper, I would say does a better job. And you can see it does wash out the image a little bit, but in washing it out, it makes it better, more perceptible, something that you want in a film. But that's the key, is that this is, if you're doing a comparison like this, there's no point to include PBR neutral, really, because PBR neutral is for sort of well lit, sort of properly exposed e-commerce scenes of a PBR render of a product, right? That's really what it's for. So when you get a scene like this, it's really broadly HDR. It's got brights and darks all over the place. They're not just sort of narrow highlights. That's not really what this is. It's not what PBR is designed for. If you have anything that uses wide gamuts, if you're using an EXR image, it's probably in a wider gamut than Rec 709. We're not designed for that at all. So these are the places where filmic tone mappers are much better. So just keep in mind that tone mapping is all trade-offs, and it really depends on what you're doing, which one you want to choose. And when you think about how we're going to use this in e-commerce, this is very closely related to photography. In a sense, we're trying to replace photography. And in photography, the number one thing you think about when you're trying to make a product look good is the lighting and the exposure. And that's exactly the same in PBR rendering. Those are the things to focus on. But the difference is when you're doing 3D rendering instead of photography is now it's really easy to make changes. You want to change the lighting? You don't have to move a light stand around and take a new photo. You just have to edit an HDR image, right? You're in a photograph, you might have to take a bunch of photos at different exposures and stack them and combine them to create an HDR version that you can then have enough information to properly tone map into your final output. We get HDR for free with PBR, right? That's our natural output and floating point. But in photography, you also tend to say, well, we'll just take a picture and then we'll fix it in post, right? We'll take it to Photoshop and we'll fix up the colors, we'll change things that need to be changed. There is no post in 3D, right? The closest thing you've got is a tone mapper. Everything has to be automated because we're building these photographs at 60 frames a second. So that's a really different mindset. And what we find when we talk to product photographers who are trying to get into 3D is they need to realize that they can't rely on post-processing anymore. And that's a significant change to their workflow. But this also enables new use cases like AR, where now the lighting wasn't ever known by the person who built the model, right? The lighting is being estimated from the user's real camera. And that allows PBR to make the product look more real in their setting, which is really cool. But again, that means that you just don't get full control over the output pixels. You have to trust in the physics that we're going to make it look right, look better. Anyway, finally, we can get into adoption here. I love this model. Shopify built this thing. Under ASUS, it always looked kind of drab. But when I build it with PBR neutral, it really shines as the true like cyan color that it is. This color that wasn't reachable with ASUS, and I think this really demonstrates how much more your products can pop when they're not washed out. And because of this, it's already gotten a lot of adoption. There were people who were really looking for this solution, and I've been really pleased by the feedback that we've gotten. So it's already available in Blender version 4.2, which I think is just out. And they call tone mapping a view transform. So you have to go hunting for it, but there is a Khronos PBR neutral option now in Blender 4.2. In terms of renderers, we've got huge adoption. 3JS has this. Model Viewer, of course, based on 3JS, also has it. Filament, Babylon.js, Play Canvas. Pretty much if you're rendering on the web, it's available in just about everything you might be using. And then as far as other tools, obviously most artists are using things like 3ds Max, Maya, Adobe tools, Keyshot, whatever, all these kinds of things. And those are going to take, they have slower release cycles. So it's going to take a little longer for these things to show up as an option. I certainly hope they do. But in the meanwhile, we have published an OpenColor.io config, which is great. This is also from the film industry, and this is a standard for representing tone mapping and color grading. So we converted our tone mapper into their format. And what's really powerful about this is most of those artist tools already support OpenColor.io profiles. So you can load in your own and basically get your own tone mapping options that way. And so you can download ours from the Khronos spec site and load it into, I think, just about any artist tool you're currently using to experiment with this right now. But again, like the real point of this is actually to avoid the problem that we've been dealing with this whole time, which is you have a product that marketing has decided has a certain sRGB color associated with it that has to show up on the page, has to match the product photos that they've already photoshopped, right, to be just right. You hand this off to a 3D artist and tell them to model this as a GLTF. And they come back having used that sRGB value in the texture. And, before this tone mapper, you'd look at the render and say, well, but that color has been adjusted clearly and it's not right anymore. So go back to the texture and tweak around with your color picker until it starts to look right on the screen. The whole purpose of using PBR neutral, I've used this throughout the pipeline, especially in the review process, is that you no longer have to ask about those colors. If marketing gave you the approved sRGB swatch, you put that into the GLB and you have confidence that it is correct. It's going to be shaded, right? Those values are going to change, right? You look at this mixer, it's not the same value of cyan all over it because it's shaded, right? That's the whole point. But you can have confidence that mathematically that is the same hue, it's the same saturation. We're doing basically the best that can be done. And so, if at that point marketing says, it still doesn't look quite right, you can have confidence to tell them, okay, then change the lighting. We don't have to change the model because we know the colors are actually correct. Maybe you need to raise the exposure a little bit if you want it to be brighter. Maybe you need to tweak the lighting if you want this shadow to be less shadowy, or you want it to have, more contrast over here. And that's a really powerful thing, because that was always the purpose of PBR, right? Is to separate this concept of the modeling from the lighting. And now I think using PBR neutral, we can finally do that within the production pipeline, where you can now say, okay, we knew what the colors are supposed to be, and now we know the model is right. And now, just like a photographer, when we want to tweak the final output to look as good as we possibly can, we don't paint the product, we change the lighting. That's what a photographer does, and that's exactly what we should be doing in 3D e-commerce as well. So that is it for my presentation, but I'm happy to take questions, because I know this is a kind of complicated and not commonly understood topic.
Well, it was a great presentation. Thank you, Emmett. Now we'll open the floor to the Q&A portion of the webinar. Please feel free to submit any questions you may have using the Q&A feature on the Zoom toolbar. And I'll kick things off with the PBR neutral makes more sRGB colors reachable, but apparently not all of them. Why is that?
Yeah, so again, the key is gradients. We have to make sure that everything is smooth as you compress these very bright, these colors that are in gamut, but way beyond the brightness a monitor can represent, which is especially around like the highlights off shiny objects of lights. And you need to bring those down into the 0 to 1 cube. But by doing so, if you map those things such that they map to the entire cube, there's no way to make those gradients be smooth. They would have to have a sharp corner to fit the sharp corner of the cube, basically. And so there's this fundamental trade-off. And you'll notice that what filmic tone mappers do is they lean very heavily on the side of smooth gradients, which is what makes them have so much less reachable set and so much desaturation in their colors. And that's what allows them to have the least like perceptual errors when you have these really broadly HDR scenes. When you're just like taking a photograph of a sunset and you want that to look good, you really need to push on the gradient side of things, and you have to give up colors to do it. For us, we looked at e-commerce and we realized, like, oh wait, that's not what our scenes tend to look like. We aren't looking at sunsets. We're looking at tiny little bright white highlights around the corners of objects. So we can actually afford to have much steeper gradients and still have them look good, and therefore fill up more of the cube. But there's a limit. If you make them completely sharp, it does start to become eye-catching and ugly. And in fact, you see that in the linear tone mapper, which is the sharpest one, right? And that's why your highlights will just suddenly break to a pure white. And the eye really perceives that as an unrealistic detail.
Can you briefly explain to us what path to white is?
Yes. Okay. So this is a term from the tone mapping community, such as it is. I actually haven't met that many people from the tone mapping community. They're hard to find. But basically, you could say that when you have a very bright color, you can look at that as a vector that's sort of exiting your 0 to 1 sRGB cube. You could say, hey, anytime that vector leaves, if I don't want to change the color at all, I could simply clip it. I could, instead of doing like a weird clamping like the default no tone mapper does, I could do something a little bit smarter, like normalize it. Just say like, oh, I'm just going to clip this vector, keep it in the exact same direction, but clip it until it stays inside the cube. That would be no path to white, because that means that if you have an orange color and it's extraordinarily bright, 1,000 times brighter than the colors around it in the scene, it would get clipped back to that exact same orange value. It turns out if you try to build a tone mapper like that, things look really weird. Because, like, for instance, if you're looking at something golden, right, you know that a yellow metal sphere, a golden sphere, will turn all white light reflected yellow, right? It multiplies that by yellow. So that means if you have like a really bright white light that's that's giving you a nice narrow specular highlight on that golden sphere, well, that would be like a pure yellow. Whatever value of yellow your gold is, that specular highlight would look exactly that saturated yellow. But that's not what we see when we look at a piece of gold. When you look at the highlights off of it, they look white, just like the white lights, which is weird because you can measure it physically and show that that light is in fact yellow. But our brains perceive it as white when it's so much brighter than the things around it. And it's exactly the same as when you take a photo of it. You'll see that the photographs, cameras have been designed to act as much like our visual cortex as possible, because that's what we compare it to, right? It's like, I look at the real thing, I look at the photo of it, do they look the same to me? Do I perceive them as the same? Camera manufacturers have been trying to narrow the gap between those for decades and decades, and they've done a good job. And so you'll see that same thing when you take a photo of something with a very bright colored light, it tends toward white, and that's called the path to white. And so that path is pretty arbitrary, right? Like, how much brighter does it have to get before it gets so much desaturated towards white? And that is, we built an equation, a function for that, for PBR neutral, that's different than the path to white in, say, ACES or in a different tone mapper. And the path to white in the no tone mapping scenario is basically accidental, right? First you clamp, if you're looking at a yellow, then maybe first you clamp the red channel. And then when green saturates, you clamp the green channel. And then when blue saturates, you clamp the blue channel. And finally, you've arrived at white. But the path you took there was very jagged and surprisingly misdirected.
Wonderful. Can you talk about how PBR neutral works with the model viewer? You mentioned adoption. So does it work right away if you already have the model viewer as a renderer on the site?
Absolutely, yeah. We're very careful about breaking changes. So ACS is still our default. So you have to manually specify tone mapper equals neutral to get this. But the next time we do a major version bump, so to version 4.0, we will be switching the default to neutral. So we think it is definitely better.
What about colors outside of sRGB, wider gamuts like P3 and CMYK?
Yeah, so right now we're focused on sRGB mostly because that's actually where the GLTF spec is focused, right? The GLTF spec defines textures as JPEGs, PNGs, and it doesn't currently handle like extra metadata around strange color gamuts or something. It just says everything is interpreted as sRGB, which is why I say, like, right now everything we do is restricted to sRGB, and likewise, at least until very recently, when you've been looking at things on the web, looking at things on monitors, just about everything is rendered into sRGB color buffers. Now that is starting to change, right? I mean, I'm here sitting on a Mac that has a P3 screen, right? It is capable of displaying wider gamut colors than exist in sRGB. We should probably look at making use of that. It's one of these things where it's probably not the top priority compared to like other things that we're fixing around PBR, but it should absolutely become a higher priority. And that will mean that we're going to have to extend GLTF at some point to take wider gamut input images and wider gamut lighting in renderers and that kind of thing. And I think that this approach that we've taken to PBR neutral rendering will extend naturally to wider gamut situations. The one place where it's going to be much more difficult is if you start with wide gamut input and then you want to render to a narrow gamut output screen like sRGB. And that's what the real film tone mappers do, and they spend a lot of time on what's called gamut mapping, which is bringing colors in that are out of gamut. And that's actually a very difficult thing that so far I've avoided. So we'll see if we get to that point or if it's really necessary. It seems like the screens are actually getting to wide gamuts before the modeling programs are. So hopefully this won't be a huge problem for us. And then CMYK, oh man, I mean, nobody has built a monitor yet that can represent all the colors in CMYK, especially C. Cyan is actually pretty far outside of most of the monitor gamuts, which is just the sad reality that we can print a color that we can't put on screen. This is a matter of physics, and we'll see if we get there. But this is up to display manufacturers, so there are just fundamental limits on color, no matter where you go.
All right, we have time for one more question. What about white point? Does grayscale lighting accurately reflect a retail lighting environment?
Yeah, so this is one that I actually went kind of deep on in the midst of doing this research. So we talk about analytical. I talked about analytical lighting in GLTF rendering, where we pick white, which is 111. Well, white point is basically asking the question, what does that mean? When you say white is 111, what color is that really? Well, it turns out sRGB defines this because it's a necessary part of the spec, and they define that white is D65, 6500 Kelvin. Is a color temperature, just like you'd buy your light bulbs, right? If you've ever bought a 3000 Kelvin bulb or 5000 Kelvin bulb, same thing. I don't think anybody's ever bought a 6500 Kelvin bulb. Usually the brightest white you can get is about 5000. 6500 is what most people, if you were to like put it in your house, it would be called like a bluish light. It's like really bright. It works really well on monitors, which is why monitors use that white point. It does not work very well as house lighting. It seems weird to us perceptually if you tried to light your whole house with D65. So it's much more common to get yellower lights, like 5000, 3000 even is quite yellow. It's almost candle flame. And so it's tempting as a mathematician to say, well, we're doing physics accurately, right? So if we're trying to replicate a retail environment that has 5000 Kelvin bulbs, then we should be using lighting that is 5000 Kelvin, and you can calculate what color that is in sRGB. It's not 111. It's not white. It's yellow, a little bit more than you might expect, honestly. And use that, and then great, PBR will just do everything correctly, and it'll look just like in retail. Well, practically speaking, this is hugely annoying, because marketing folks have sRGB swatches that they're picking out based on their product colors or whatever else. And those marketing swatches, nobody's thinking about what lighting they're looking at them under, right? You get like a printed swatch and you're like, yeah, that looks right. And you don't think about the fact that like, oh, was I looking at this under a 5000 Kelvin bulb or a 3000 Kelvin bulb or something, right? Like that gets kind of lost. So from a practical perspective, it is much, much easier to say, hey, our lighting is always 111, technically D65, and our sRGB values are whatever we had in our photos that are also being shown in sRGB. And then we can just say that they're going to be the same and kind of not worry about the subtle differences in white point that are actually happening. It's one of these things where it's like, it's technically not quite the right physical way to do things, but it's so much easier to think about rather than trying to realize that your photograph that's represented as a JPEG was also taken under some non-white lighting that you didn't measure, and that has an effect on what the actual underlying base color of it was. Nobody wants to deal with that. So this is a worthwhile simplification to just use grayscale lighting.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation today. And we appreciate your time and effort putting together this tone mapper. It's truly impressive. As a reminder, a recording of this presentation along with the slides will be available on the Khronos Group website by the end of the week, and a direct link will be sent to you in a follow-up email. As you leave the webinar, please take a moment to fill out the survey that pops up Your feedback is important to us, and it helps us improve these presentations. And please let us know if there are other Khronos-related topics you may be interested in. And thank you for joining us. Have a great day.